outline for this talk. Start off with goals as before. I would like for all of you to be able to answer these questions. What's statistical power? What's unique about genetic association studies in terms of statistical power? How can I conduct a power analysis for an association study? What is heritability and what is heritability not? The structure of this talk is going to be as such. We'll have an open, interactive, very general dialogue about statistical power. For some of you, I hope, it will be extraordinarily low level. For most of you, I hope, it will be very beneficial moving on. And I will play that interactively. We'll see how it's going. And so I can toggle the pace appropriately. We'll do that general discussion. Then we'll see a particular genetic association specific power calculator that is a GUI, graphical user interface, that you can point and click. Okay, so you can go and do your own genetic association power calculations in this program. There are ubertons, that's a new word, ubertons of power calculators. If you've written grants, you've done some flavor of power calculation. If you've gotten power calculations written for you, calculated for you, I'll introduce you to a handful that are specific to genetic association as well, that are even more robust than the one that we'll see. But the one that we'll see, you can go and do on your own after this discussion. See how things toggle, and we'll have a discussion regarding it as well. Then we'll pause. I'll take a drink of water, and then we'll talk about heritability. Specifically about heritability, it was mentioned. If you really want to learn about heritability in twin studies, where do you go? Right, you go to Boulder, right? So I'll touch it briefly. Heritability and estimating heritability. Okay, so power. You've seen something like this maybe before. I'll come back to it, where we have a null distribution that's indicated by the dotted line over here. We've got an alternative distribution. And we toggle parameters, right? We toggle parameters like how much power we actually want, what type of type 1 error we're constrained to, what sample size we need, what kind of effect size we have, and there are calculations that go into these pieces. We'll discuss this in a very general way in a minute, and then we'll talk about, again, specifically genetic association. Okay, so a little-known fact, most statisticians pull definitions from businessdictionary.com. So if you look up statistical power, pulling it from businessdictionary.com is the preferred method for doing so. A number or percentage that indicates a probability a study will obtain a statistically significant effect. For example, a power of 80% or 0.8 means a survey or study, when conducted repeatedly over time, is likely to produce a statistically significant result 8 times out of 10. I'm not a huge fan of this definition, largely because of its imprecision. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. So I like to say statistical power is the chance of finding something when something's going on. Okay, the chance of finding something when something's going on. Okay, that's still a little loose, so let's define it precisely. The probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when the alternative hypothesis is true. So it's a conditional probability. It's the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when a specific alternative hypothesis is true. So we have to say something about the alternative hypothesis in order to be able to define power. Okay? What affects power? Okay, so in our discussions, I'm going to ignore potential complications, controversies about being a frequentist and throwing things in a null hypothesis testing framework, about Bayesian posterior probabilities, p-value controversies, these are things that are worth thinking about, knowing about. The American Statistical Association put out a paper about p-value abuse not too long ago, and it's worth looking at for anyone. I'm ignoring those for the time being. I'm going to go back to this. So this will be interactive. So the null hypothesis, okay? This picture is a distribution of a particular test statistic, your favorite test statistic, under the null hypothesis. So on the x-axis, what is this? It's the so the null is the possible things that this test statistic can be. It's the possible values of the test statistic. Okay? So what's my range, for all intents and purposes, of my test statistic under the null distribution? Yeah, so negative 0.3 to positive 0.3. I'm doing this interactively just so I can use this guy. For all intents and purposes, negative 3 to 0.3. That's the vast majority of the distribution of this null hypothesis. The test statistic that we're calculating, the possible values it can take. So what's the y-axis? What's that? Probability, the relative frequency. And so we can't really think about like at a particular value the probability, but we can talk about the area. So what's the probability that under the null hypothesis the test statistic is less than, or is negative? What's that? Hey, we're making this class, exactly. If people don't answer, I'll move really fast because I'm putting this at a level that I think will be helpful. But if people aren't answering it, I'll realize that everybody's zoned out, and I'll just fast forward. I'll bring up the old math slides that I took out from earlier. There's 20 of them. Yes, that's right. Actually, I put them at the end of the talk. Honestly, I did. I put several of them back in, so it's the punishment. Okay, one of the punishments. Okay, so I can take areas of that under that distribution. Okay, what is the mean of the test statistic, general test statistic, under the alternative hypothesis? What's the mean of the test statistic under the alternative hypothesis? Yeah, about 0.27. About 0.27. And what's the chance of getting? This is a nice one. What's the chance of getting more than a test statistic higher than this value, given that the alternative is true? So don't answer yet. I want everybody to think about this. So what's the chance of seeing something bigger than this value under the null hypothesis? Oh, I'm sorry, under the alternative. Thank you. Oh, actually, under the null hypothesis. How about that? 5% under the alternative hypothesis. And under the... I'm sorry. Time out. I'm confusing myself. I originally asked about under the alternative hypothesis, so we'll stick to that. What's the chance of seeing something bigger than that under the alternative hypothesis? 80%. And under the null? 5%. So this is old hat. Old hat for most of us, but it's worth thinking about a little bit more. So we typically establish some level of comfort to make a certain flavor of error. What are the two ways that we can, assuming that we've done everything wisely about how we're setting up this testing framework, we picked up a good study design, we've recruited people in the wise way, we've measured things wisely. The two ways that we can mess up. A type 1 error is raising the red flag, we found an association, when in fact nothing was going on, we're under the null distribution, but it just so happened that the one time we calculate that test statistic, it ended up being more than this critical value that we established. What's the other way we could screw up? Yeah, so type 2, and for this particular alternative hypothesis, what's the chance of a type 2 error? 20%. So I've been intentional about saying under this particular alternative hypothesis, right? So what's the true alternative hypothesis? Yeah, what do you mean? We have no idea what the true alternative hypothesis is. If you actually knew the alternative hypothesis, what the truth was, why in the heck are you doing a test? Right? You already know. Okay, so there's something else happening that we often have. We'll often conduct a power analysis and have a power curve that varies something. In genetic association studies, often it's the minor allele frequency, for example. If we're testing a single SNP, if you're doing a GWAS, you might vary the minor allele frequency and see how that affects your power, and we'll see that in some of the quanto examples in a minute. What's Cohen's d? Or what? Yeah. What's Cohen's d? It's just a measure of effect size. It's kind of a generic measure of effect size. In this case, this is a cool site. This is a grad student who put this little picture of power, and you can toggle things and move things around. And I believe this is a one sample z-test that this is based on. So Cohen's d is just the alternative mean divided by the standard deviation. And so here it's 0.28. But that's the effect size. So one way to increase power is to increase the effect size. We don't know the effect size, but one way to increase power is to increase the effect size. Okay, so points to take home. We typically establish some degree of, I'm willing to make this type of mistake. Typically, we establish that type 1 error. We talked about the magic, what's the magic GWAS p-value? Yeah, so 5 times 10 to the minus 8, the infamous, maybe I should say, 5 times 10 to the minus 8, because we're taking this 5% type 1 error that we're willing to make, and we're really conservatively Bonferroni correcting it by 1 million independent tests, regardless of the number that we actually test. Okay, so we establish that, and then we typically assume we want to find some certain amount of power, and we toggle the effect size, the sample size, in order to achieve that amount of power. Okay, very general. Very general. We'll get more specific. But before any questions before moving on. That's good. Okay. So here's a paper. I've tried to paste papers into talks so that you can pull them if you'd like. But statistical power and significance testing in large-scale genetic studies. Pak Sham and Sean Purcell. Does the name Sean Purcell ring a bell for anyone doing the tutorial? Right. So he was the original author of Planck, the 1.07 that got sped up considerably when it moved under the auspices of Christopher Chang. So this is a worthwhile read. A chunk here. You don't have control over the genetic architecture. Talk about the alternative hypothesis, but we don't know what the alternative hypothesis should be, so we have to be a little wise about it. We can do that, use that wisdom in a couple different ways. We do have control over subject selection. Definition, this sounds like Dr. Crane, right? Definition and measurement of phenotype. Phenotype, right? How many and which variants, covariate adjustments, the statistical method, and so on. There are many power calculators. And so it's nice to be able to kind of use something. Oftentimes you're going to code your own power calculation specific to the type of study design you have in mind. But here are a handful. GPC, CATS, GAS. Actually, GAS is an online implementation of CATS by Gonzalo Abacasas' lab. PGA. R has a handful of power calculator, power programs, power packages. You've played around with R. You actually loaded a library, the QQman library today. You can load these libraries as well, and so on. We're talking single variant power calculators here, but you can also have power calculations for gene-based tests, for meta-analyses. You can use simulation, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Quanto. Reason being is it's point and click. We can talk about some of the things that came up yesterday, questions about modes of inheritance, study design, and the like. It's a flexible framework. We learned yesterday, Q and I and Tim had a conversation about intuition, and if we toggle this, what should happen? And Quanto does one thing, and other programs do other things. So power calculation, Allison last, but power calculation, I'll give a cynic's, I'm a statistician, but I'll give a cynic's perspective of power. Like, you never know what the answer is, right? You're not doing what you're doing. You don't know what the answer is. So in my mind, in terms of like conducting a power analysis, you want to make sure that you're not doing something egregiously wrong. You want to make sure that you're doing something that's reasonable, right? That you don't have 6% power to conduct a particular study, that you have something that's a little bit more robust, but you're always doing things that you don't know the answer to, otherwise you wouldn't be proposing what you're proposing. Okay, so Quanto. Jim Gouderman and John Morrison, you can download this. Right now it only runs on PCs. They're emailed with Jim recently, and they're developing a Unix and a Mac version currently. Several different study designs. You can test for gene effects, environment effects, gene-environment interactions, gene-gene interactions, different study designs where you've got case control studies, which we, if you think of Alzheimer's disease versus not, matched or unmatched, that you might match on particular covariates of interest, age and gender, case sibling, case parent, case only, and continuous trait. So today you did a continuous trait GWAS, and you can power this based on assumptions you're making about the outcome. So it looks something like this. And again, this is more so that we can be thinking about these parameters. The Quanto documentation is good, and I'll throw that up on the website. So I'll place that on the website so that you can see. We'll go through examples that they have as well. So if you have questions later on that you're dying to have the answer to, you can get those answered. But you can see here, the outcome is disease. So we're dealing with a case control study. Design matched case control. So some covariates you're interested in, you might match on age of death, for example, and gender, and you might have a case get matched to a handful of controls that have similar ages of death and genders. Hypothesis, gene-environment interactions of what you're testing, desired power, significance, 0.05, a two-sided test. A mode of inheritance is something you're assuming as well. We talked a little bit yesterday about mode of inheritance and complex diseases being a bit of an anomaly, but it places an assumption about the relationship of the genetic variant and the outcome. So it places assumptions on how we think that operates. Do we need 2 copies of the minor allele in order to exact some influence on phenotype or risk? Do we need just 1 copy? Or is there a scale such that each copy you get, you're at an increased, more and more increased risk? And that's encoded in mode of inheritance. Allele frequency, so environmental factor, the prevalence of an environmental factor, and the disease model. And we'll talk about these parameters in a second. Okay, so here we might be interested in testing a main effect of a gene for a disease, make certain assumptions. We can populate this particular program with these assumptions. And I'll mention, just for those that are interested in nuts and bolts, the way this particular power calculator works, it does a likelihood ratio test, and it calculates the expected likelihood for both the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. So it averages over the distributions, the genetic distributions, and outcome distributions. and then calculates based on the non-centrality parameter. It finds the non-centrality parameter that you need to find the desired power. So that's how the nuts and bolts of this works. And it depends on the study design that you establish how that is exactly done. So here, assume a disease prevalence about 10%, 2 alleles. We think that there's a recessive mode of inheritance, so you have to have 2 copies of the disease allele. The genotype itself, and so this is something we talked about last time, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Allele frequencies and genotype frequencies remain constant, and one of the results from that is that you can take a genotype frequency or take a genotype frequency and get an allele frequency and go back and forth between the two. So if a genotype frequency is 40%, then we can infer that the allele frequency of the probability of an A allele is 63%. 63% squared is 40%. We want 80% power. We're setting our type 1 error rate at 5%. We're doing a two-sided test and a matched case control design. So case control design, we're going to be using logistic regression in this setting. The matched allows us to have for each case, we've got a pool of controls. It could be 1-to-1 matching. We can make it 2-to-1 matching, what have you. It just changes the logistic regression to a conditional logistic regression if we're in this matching setting. But go ahead, Rich.
Is there any conflict between disease prevalence and matched case control? Like, are those linked up? Do you have one case for 9 controls in this design?
No, they don't have to match the prevalence.
10% is a population parameter.
The 10% is a population parameter. Exactly. So again, if you want to play with this program after Friday Harbor, knock yourself out. Again, there are many ways to skin that proverbial cat, but this is one of those ways. Of all the ways, this is one of them. So for this particular setting, we set the allele frequency to 0.63. We're assuming a recessive mode of inheritance. The program itself will then calculate the different risk groups. Because we have a recessive mode of inheritance, we're pooling the in this case, the major homozygotes and the heterozygotes and the minor homozygotes. And again, I'm just going through populating this particular program in thinking about how to parameterize or how to think about power, what things come into effect when we're dealing with power for a genetic association study. So we have our population prevalence. We can calculate genetic effect. Here we're parameterizing that in terms of an odds ratio of 2. So we think that the odds of disease for homozygote majors is 2-fold greater than the odds in the heterozygotes and the homozygote minors. Homozygote majors, sorry. Okay, so we keep filling things out. We hit calculate, and we get out that in order to conduct this study, to garner 80% power with a 2-sided test, 5% significance level, assuming a recessive mode of inheritance and a particular allele frequency, we need 135, and in this case, it's 135 units, which is a matched case control pair. Okay, so you need 270 to test for a SNP effect in a matched case control design. Questions here? Yeah, go ahead, Trey.
So, given that you have a model that says that it's recessive and that the OA is the risk variable,
Yeah.
then why are we doing a 2-sided test?
Because I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if.
So it turned out that having the 2 was protective of the disease, right? Less
Right.
And your model is completely wrong.
So you could argue to use a one-sided test. And what would so everybody heard? I'll repeat the question. We're saying that this is a recessive mode of inheritance, and that the risk is conferred with those that have the double capital A. So why not do a one-sided test? And I think that you could absolutely argue that. What would be if we did assume a one-sided test? What would be what would that do to our results here? A protective trait can be recessive as well.
You're saying it is the risk gene.
But yeah.
You actually have a directional
Right.
hypothesis here.
Yeah.
So if it turned out to be the opposite, you would have already rejected it.
Right. But so if we were able to assume a one-sided test, if we could argue that for reasonably, what would be the impact on the number of matched pairs that we need? Should be less. Yeah, we garner information for assumptions when they hold, right?
Can I ask about the matched pairs in this? Is that I assume there's some flexibility in that.
Sure.
Or is it kind of generally thought that matching case control, regardless of the prevalence of the disease, is a good approach?
So the idea of matching, sometimes it's feasible, sometimes it's not. I think most of the studies, I'm not aware of many matched case control studies in AD. I don't know if anyone else has had exposure to those in AD.
Suppose you get a patient from a family, and with each patient you also have unaffected citizen. In that case, they share certain factors that from the same family.
Oh, so this is
They're
the
not
match
completely independent.
So
It's still case control design.
I see.
Just an example.
yeah, so and this is outside the context of a family design necessarily, where we're garnering information from transmissions and families and shared genetics. But we might be interested in controlling for the effect of age or gender on outcome. And if so, we would ascertain a case, and the controls that we match with that case help us to control for the effect, the potentially confounding effect of whatever we're controlling for. And so an age of death, for example, and for AD. And the testing implications on that are just simply that the logistic regression likelihood changes. So it becomes the denominator of your likelihood becomes a summation over those that, for a particular case, a summation over those that you're matched against. And so this gets implemented in something like, it's very similar to proportional hazards regression, where you have to consider the risk set, the folks that are at risk at a particular time. And so that's conditional logistic regression. Okay. And was mentioned by Q, you can do different study designs with related individuals as well. We mentioned in passing family-based studies. There are some family-based studies in AD. There were family-based studies early on when we're talking about linkage that you have to have families. In the case control AD world, that's not the case, but you have different designs that you can toggle through. So it's important just to keep in mind the study design drives the test statistic that drives the picture of the alternative distribution under the alternative hypothesis and the distribution under the null hypothesis. Okay, so you can putz around with different inputs in this particular program and see how things work. So one of the things that got brought up last night was the intuition behind if you were to decrease the prevalence that you're assuming, what would happen? So we assumed a 10% prevalence. I'll ask you guys, because my intuition was off. If we decrease the prevalence, what should happen to the power? All things being held constant, what should happen to the power? We decrease the prevalence. What's that?
It'll reduce, I would assume, because if the prevalence is lower, you need to get way more of that Or you have to increase your sample size or increase your power?
So we had diverging intuitions about what happens when you decrease the prevalence. What happens when you decrease the prevalence in Quanto is the power goes down in Quanto, right? No, power goes up in Quanto. And that was my intuition, but other programs that do power calculation based on simulation can do just the opposite. So another reason why power calculations are your best guess, but there's uncertainty involved across the board, even based on what program you use and what framework it calculates the power for. So regardless of your intuition there, you can find a program that satisfies your intuition, which is, I don't know if that's comforting, it's not to me by any shape of imagination. Maybe it's comforting when you're writing a grant and you say, this is my best guess. Is that how I feel? Something wrong here. Yeah, something wrong. Okay, so I'm going to go through one more example in Quanto, a gene-environment interaction. This was something that was tried in our group in Plink. Does this particular gene interact with environmental tobacco smoke, affecting lung function? So we make assumptions based on this particular gene behaving in a recessive fashion with a particular allele frequency, a binary exposure variable, 30% of children exposed. And then this is what you would have similar to what was done in the tutorial today, where we have a quantitative phenotype. So in order to define the distribution of our outcome, we specify that we assume it's a normally distributed outcome. That was mentioned earlier, or at least in our group actually Paul brought it up before. Know the distribution of the thing that you're wanting to operate a GWAS on. Here, mean FEV, 2 liters with a standard deviation of 300 milliliters, and these are independent individuals. So here, the fact that we're testing an interaction, we have to posit some model of that interaction. And so again, we may not know what that looks like. Hopefully we have preliminary data that suggests something to populate our power calculations. Here we're assuming in the general population, those exposed have an FEV1 that's 75 milliliters lower. And then those exposed with the variant have an additional decrease of 100 milliliters for their forced expiratory volume in a second. We can populate those same parameters as before. Here we wouldn't have to change anything for the gene assumptions, allele frequency of 0.63, recessive mode of inheritance. We specify the prevalence of the environmental risk factor and enter these parameters for the marginal effect of gene, the marginal effect of the environment, and then the interaction, so the non-additive piece of having both the gene effect and the environment effect. And we hit the magic button, and we get a test of interaction here. We need 1,374 subjects. And so one important piece that we haven't done in these examples, this program was created in about 2002, prior to the GWAS era. I think the first GWAS was really about 2005. And so one of the things that's not done in these examples is any flavor of adjustment for multiple testing, right? So we're assuming a single test. And so how many tests did everyone conduct today? Really fast. 500,000. So we're probably going to need more than 1,300 people to test for this interaction. if we want to have an adjustment, an appropriate adjustment for 500,000. And you can toggle with those. I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Does it actually let you change the p-value to alpha?
Yeah.
So you can just put it in.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So let's see if I have a slide. Yeah, I didn't toggle with the alpha value at all. Oh, here we go. So, I mean, again, this is the reason I selected Quanto, or the programming committee selected Quanto, is because it offers a way to see what you're assuming and to get it in a palatable way. I can putz around with the type 1 error rate. So if I really wanted to do a GWAS, what would I put in instead of my 0.05? Yeah, 5 times 10 to the negative 8, 0.05 divided by a million, right? So I could do the same kind of testing. And what would happen to the number of folks that we need? Yeah. So I encourage you, it's didactically, it's worth a glance at this. Again, this was done in the early 2000s, Jim Gauderman, and they're updating things to I think, for platforms, but also to reflect complexity and gene-based testing and the like. So multiple testing. We talked about this before, but we're alpha levels just for a particular test. And if we ran multiple experiments completely under the null hypothesis, we expect alpha times the number of tests to come up significant if we have a powered study. And so chasing down which of those that are real is a tricky thing, right? And if we looked at that Manhattan plot from yesterday, if I looked at all of those that were under 0.05, I would have a very long road to hoe. Again, if we bump up the number of experiments we do, the problem gets exacerbated. So our typical, that infamous p-value is just a Bonferroni. It's a very conservative way. We can use false discovery rate as well, where we're constraining the proportion of true in the rejected sets. So the number of tests that we declare significant, we're toggling the proportion of those that are actually true. Bayesian flavors, I said I'd just touch frequentist stuff, but you can throw, for those that are familiar with a Bayesian paradigm, we can throw informative priors. In the Bayesian framework, we have a prior distribution, we have a posterior distribution given data, and we can place information, and we'll, I think, talk a little bit about annotation later today, or tomorrow. Annotation tomorrow, where you can upweight variants that are potentially amino acid changing or have downstream functionality of some sort. So you might be in advance of knowing anything about the particular disease or the genetics influencing it, you can say, well, I think that this particular variant is more likely to be associated with disease. And so you can weight those in a prior distribution wisely in a Bayesian framework. You can do permutation testing. In a case control design, for example, we can just randomly permute case control status and use a permutation framework to simulate power. Okay, questions before I move on? A broad, specific, an allusion to a whole bunch more power calculators that also make certain assumptions about test design or study design, genetic parameters that we don't know the answer to. I'll make the comment again that we often assume an additive mode of inheritance because when we're doing large-scale testing, because it's robust to misspecification. So if we're wrong, it's often not so bad.